Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today I'd like to take you on a trunk show of quilts that we've kept for ourselves. Stay tuned. Hi, my name's Michelle, and today I'd like to present a trunk show of the quilts that I've made that we have kept for ourselves and for our own use. How many quilts does one family really need? For Jason and I, we're a family of two, and we have a lot of quilts. I discovered my passion for quilting a number of years ago, and I made a quilt for the bed, and a quilt for the spare room, and a quilt for the sofa for each of us. And then I said to Jason, I'm just going to keep making quilts because I love it, even if we don't need any more. And so the collection has grown, but the vast majority of my quilts are gifts for friends and family. How about you? Do you give away most of your quilts? Do you have a large family that needs a lot of quilts? Or do you just make them and keep them for yourself because you love them? Leave a comment down below and tell us what you do with your quilts. For this trunk show, I think I'll break it into 2 episodes. In this first, I'm going to start with some of the earliest quilts that I've made and that we've kept for ourselves. So let's dive right in. The first quilt I'd like to share is this big block quilt. It has lots of orange and rusts and purple and fall colors all over it, and I fell in love with the fabric collection when I first saw it. The colors and the theme remind me of my wedding anniversary. Jason and I got married in the fall in Canada, and these colors were really prevalent as part of our wedding celebrations. I was also learning to machine quilt, to free motion quilt at the time, and this was an early effort at machine quilting that turned out fairly well. The quilt is still with us. It's the size that I like to call a sofa size. It's too small for a bed, but it's perfect for curling up on the sofa to read a good book or to watch television. And it's also turned out to be a great picnic size quilt. We take it now whenever we go to have a picnic with friends or to spend some time on the beach. I'm happy to throw it on the sand, throw it on the grass, and then just toss it into the washing machine when we're finished. It's probably been around for about 20 years or more, and it's still holding up really, really well. The next quilt in the trunk show is this quilt that I'm calling A Study in Beige. This was inspired by a quilt called The Friendship Star by Alex Anderson. It is, for me, a collection of leftovers of other quilts. For a while, I was making a lot of low volume, low contrast quilts in creams and beiges for friends and family so that it would go with any decor. And I had some leftover bits and pieces. And when I saw the Friendship Star from Alex Anderson, I realized that the Friendship Stars, the pinwheels, the 4-patch blocks, they could all go together as long as the math worked out. And in this instance, it did. I needed to make a few extras, of course, to finish the quilt, but I'm happy with the final product. I think it's elegant and sophisticated. You do see a little bit of a lesson learned for me in that I have a fairly large red border on this quilt, and when I was machine quilting it, I decided not to quilt the border, which I think was probably a mistake. I'm not sure if I want to go back now, many, many years later, and try and put some quilting into that border. I often think about it, but then I never get around to it, so we'll see. Maybe in the future I'll add some more quilting to that border just to tack it down. I still love the neutrals of it and where contrast between light and dark is very subtle, but I think it's a really pretty quilt. This quilt is the ultimate scrappy quilt. I worked on this with a friend. We swapped fabrics, so there's a number of fabrics in here that are Allison's fabrics, and then a number of fabrics that are my fabrics. This is from, the original pattern is from a book called Nickel Quilts by Pat Speth. It uses 5-inch squares in the center, and then the sashing blocks and stars are also cut from 5-inch pieces. It's a great pattern that really showcases fabric in the middle. And you'll see in a later video, I've used this pattern many times over the years particularly when I want to showcase a particular fabric. This quilt has spent many years on the bed in our guest room, and for a number of years it was very, very sunny in that guest room, so you can see where a lot of the fabrics have faded. That in some ways makes me a little sad, but on the other hand, it shows that the quilt has been used and loved and washed and seen, and ultimately I think that's the purpose of our quilts. This quilt captures some of my very favorite colors. I love the orange and the green in this quilt. And this was the first time years and years ago when I saw a picture of a quilt in a magazine and I thought, I wonder if I can recreate that. Do I really need a pattern in order to figure out how to make this quilt? And this was my first attempt at that, and it worked. I decided I had the vast majority of 2.5-inch strips in my collection, and so that was the size I would use in order to make each of these squares. And from there it was just a question of deciding how big the diamond in the middle I wanted it to be, and then filling out the grid to get the final product. Some of my very favorite fabrics are in here. I love the goldfish in the orange, and I love the greens. And then the blue, I think, just provides that contrast to set it all off. I often use this when watching TV or reading a book just to cover my lap. It's a great quilt. The next quilt in our trunk show is this green quilt that I've had in my living room for many years. It's based on a pattern called African Safari by Jean Boyd. And this was a great lesson in the importance of contrast for me. You can see where the border and the top part of the square in a square kind of blur together. I didn't select fabrics that had enough of a contrast, and this quilt has always reminded me of that lesson for future quilts and designs. I still love it. I put some free motion quilting in the center, did a little bit of hand quilting in the border, and we still use it in the living room, but it does remind me of the importance of contrast when selecting your fabrics. This next quilt is crazy fun. It's called the Bug Jars, and it's based on a pattern that I have here from the Bottle Quilt Company. What fun it was to collect the fabrics to go in the bug jars. I love bugs. They don't bother me at all. And having this bug jar quilt just makes me smile. For years, it hung over the railing in our upstairs staircase, so we would see it every day. The original pattern has some paper-pieced creatures and insects, but I was content to take the simple route and actually fussy cut some of the escaped bugs from the original fabrics, and then just use some fusible interface and fuse them on and applique them on to the bug quilt. I love the giant butterfly that's escaping. I love the little trail of ladybugs crawling around the quilt. I even found some fabric that looked like wood grain to build that into the shelves. This is one of my all-time favorite quilts. It makes me smile whenever I see it. We often put it as an extra topper on our bed in the winter when it's very cold. It's not big enough to be a bed quilt, but if you just want that extra little bit of weight and warmth on a cold winter's night, we sometimes throw this quilt on. This next quilt I've called Here, Fishy, Fishy, Fish. It's fun because the back is a flannel printed with cats, and on the front I've used a goldfish fabric. So I just love the idea of the cats on the back trying to chase after the goldfish on the front. This was one of my very first efforts at paper piecing, and it's a very simple block, but it really taught me a lot about paper piecing and really set me up for success for some much more complicated paper piecing later on in my sewing journey. It's a fun quilt. The blue and orange, as you can see from some of my earlier quilts, is a theme that I like, and I was really pleased with the way this one turned out. This next quilt was made for Jason. He is the ultimate cat person. He loves cats. And if I wasn't allergic, we probably would have a house full of cats. So as it is, he needs to be content with virtual cats or fake cats or cats on quilts. So I made this cat quilt for him. Again, it was inspired, I think, when I found the fabric that looked like cat fur. So there's the yellow, the beige, and the gray cat fur printed fabric. And I paper pieced these cats. The lessons from the Fishy Fishy Fish quilt really paid off for this more difficult cat paper piecing project. In the bottom of this quilt is one dog. We have good friends who had a dog named Wiley, as in Wile E. Coyote, and Wiley was a lovely, lovely dog. We all shed a lot of tears when Wiley left us. And one day, out of the blue, Jason just said, "I don't like dogs very much, but I love Wiley." And I thought to myself as I was making this cat quilt that I needed to make sure to put one dog block just to represent Wiley. So she's in the bottom corner of this quilt being supervised and maybe antagonized by all of the other cats. The rest of the fabric is cat themed. There's some cat paws in the border and some actual cats on the printed border. And it's another fun project. From cats to chickens. This is my first of two chicken quilts that I'm going to show you. I collected fabric for a very long time for this chicken quilt, and every single piece of fabric is chicken themed. I even think the background looks a little bit like chicken feed that the chicken would pick at if it were eating it off the ground. The back of the quilt has a bit of a chicken fence fabric, the kind of fabric that you would put, the kind of fencing that you would put around a chicken coop to keep the chickens contained. And then this is really small half square triangles all pieced together into these chicken blocks. The combs on the top of the chickens' heads are three-dimensional prairie points. And it was a real challenge to my skills given how long ago I made this quilt. It would be something I'd be prepared to tackle today, but I think I was pretty ambitious when I took this quilt on back in the day. The quilting on it as well is something that I look back on and think, wow, I had a lot of patience back then with that really close echo straight stitching around the chickens and then a really tight free motion quilting in the body of the quilt. The final quilt in this trunk show journey is this chubby chicken quilt. This is based on a fabric from Black Mountain Quilts, and I got it as a kit from Connecting Threads. They are so cute. These are chickens that are fused onto a background fabric, and then I've used a blanket stitch around them. I just think they're adorable with their little beaks and their little pudgy bodies, and then the bright colors to really set them off. This is used in our living room a lot. I'll also take this one outside on a cool evening if I want to sit outside and read, and I can't quite accept that the weather isn't summer, but I do want to spend that time outside. So I use this quilt a lot. It is also big enough that it becomes a bit of a bed topper as well on those cold nights. It's not big enough to be the bed quilt, but if we're looking for a little extra weight and warmth, this quilt often makes it onto the bed. So there you have it, 10 quilts that I've made that we've kept for ourselves. Really interested to hear about what quilts you choose to keep and which ones you choose to give away. Don't forget to leave a comment, like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks again, and enjoy making the most of your fabric bits and pieces.